So we left off, we saw the Ibn Ezra. So we're up to source 7. But I want to sketch out for you what I hope we're going to be doing over the next week or so. And I had an idea. The idea is as follows. We, I think, as Orthodox, as Frum students of Torah, have become so used to the idea. It's almost unthinkable otherwise. That which we are learning, the Yesod HaShlishi, Hashem's incorporeality, that Ein le guf, musaguf, nothing that is not non-physical in any way, shape or form. We are brought up with it and we accept it as being ordinary. Yes? The truth is I don't think we fully appreciate how radical an idea it was, and I want to try and show this and demonstrate this in 2 ways. First of all, just I want to share with you a very quick idea, but just to make you a little bit uncomfortable. Because what we tend to think about is that the main import, the consequence, the thrust of this Yesod is Shlilas HaHagshama, right? The rejection of Hashem being corporeal. Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, Zatzal, he had a fantastic series of shurim on the Yud Gimel Ikrim. Some of it is in an English book in Feldheim, but I think there's a far better depiction in a little sefer from one of his Talmidim, Rav Bechhofer, and where he captured from and transcribed from the cassettes of his series of shurim, which are astounding. And in there, he makes very clear the following idea. It is equally erroneous and mistaken and wrong to think of Hashem as spiritual as much as it is to think of him as physical. We cannot utilize any category. He does not fit into any category that we know or possibly even that we can conceive of. And here, I don't want to take that idea further because that's quite fascinating. And it is true, the Rambam was focusing primarily on the idea of him not being a guf, and not being, because there's no shinoi and there's no... What would be, if I were to ask you, in your understanding, who or what is a malach? Let's take the most sublime malach that we can think of, without getting too technical. Srofim, Oifanim, Sar Hagodol, Matat, whatever. Okay. They're certainly not physical in any way, right? So we would say they are spiritual. They are, in our mind, they are ruchani. Okay. If we are to put Hashem into that same category, into that same class of reality, then we've limited Hashem. Yeah. In the same way that we've limited him. So it's not just...
So they must be a little bit physical, though. Because...
Why?
Because if we say...
Why must they be a little bit physical? Maybe they are totally spiritual.
So if they are totally spiritual, and we would limit Hashem if we put him in...
Then Hashem isn't spiritual.
Then he isn't spiritual.
Correct. Right, that's exactly the point. Yeah. So, what is he? Very good. We don't know. Not only we don't know, we can't know. Logically. And people, and this is I think it's just a great way of making the point. Mm-hmm. It is equally erroneous to say that Hashem is spiritual as to say he is physical. It could be that saying he is physical is a bigger dumb mistake. It's a stupider or whatever word you want to use, right? But in terms of concept, he's not spiritual either. What is he?
Hashem.
He's Hashem. Very good. Okay, and there's more that comes with that. That was point number 1, just a thought. Point number 2, and here is where it will get a little bit more controversial.
I'm still comfortable.
Sorry?
You said you will make us a little bit uncomfortable.
Well, you're still comfortable. I'm sorry. I failed. I failed. I'll have to try harder, come up with something more radical. Okay, so here, this might make you uncomfortable. It certainly made me somewhat uncomfortable, is when I began to research a little bit into the history of the... there were 3 or possibly 4 rounds of what is known as the pulmus, the controversy against the Rambam. The Rambam, as you know, came up against controversy at various stages, some in his lifetime, a number after, and we want to discuss part 2. We're going to discuss part 2, which happened in the south of France and Spain, northern Spain, Italy, and involved the Ramban that we're going to talk about. This is round 2, and the idea is then also to show that in some sense, this controversy has not gone away. What do I mean by that? Although, broadly speaking, it is true that the Rambam's idea, or probably most of his ideas, have become mainstream and accepted as the normative, it's still, for example, not that common to find, certainly in the yeshiva world, for want of a better term, people who study Moreh Nevuchim. And there are those, to this day, we're going to go down to a modern controversy where there are those who have written about and have even wanted to claim that the Rambam was not by any means the only Deya. And some even want to say that Rashi was a corporealist. Rashi held, yes, a certain professor who visited here not all that long ago.
Was refuted, that idea.
Well, I'm going to go through the sources with you on that.
I read a book about this, very interesting.
I have, yeah, okay. A certain professor who visited here not that long ago very much put forward this view, and I'm going to, in one of his books, and I'm going to go through some of the work that refutes it.
Which book? The Gvul of the something? Limits of something?
Yeah, that's right. But he's not the only one. There are others. But what it shows is, and we're going to show that really, to some extent, it is continuing, although we have to be, there is one major distinction, and that is, as we're going to see, the people that were involved in certainly because we're going to talk about the second round of the Pulmus and the Ramban, which was in the 1230s, they were, on both sides of the debate, were not in any way, we can't compare it to the Slifkins or whatever, of the Shapiros or whatever of today's world. It's a very unequal debate in that sense. But be that as it may, we'll get to that a little bit, hopefully a little bit later today. That was sort of the introduction. So that first point from Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, and showing that this very idea that we are learning evoked a big response amongst Rishonim, Choshev Rishonim, as we will see, and the Ramban's letter against it. But first, we have a little bit more work to do. We've got 2 more pages here. Okay, so we're going to look at this is an interesting piece of Moreh Nevuchim, source 7. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you first of all what he says. And it contains within it really 2 chidushim. Number 1, the Rambam, this is so central, this is so important to the Rambam, this idea that the rejecting in any way Hashem's corporeality, that he sees it, and you're going to see, he says that this is something we need to educate even those who may not be so intelligent. They have to be aware of this. There's no choice. Even though at the same time he's basically admitting they can't really understand it. He means children and women in his Ktanim V'Noshim, Secholim Chasrei HaSeichel, as you're going to see here. So on the one hand, he is telling us, and this is where, if we are honest, we have a really interesting challenge. And the challenge is to understand that the Torah, as it seems to be written, and we're going to see a Chovos Halevavos a little bit later today, as to why this is. The Torah is written, the Rambam accepts Dibra Torah Koloshen B'nei Adam. People experience things, the average person, he writes elsewhere, I couldn't bring every Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, he writes elsewhere, the average person experiences things through their five senses primarily, and also to some extent through their imagination, using the brain. We can imagine things which maybe are not that grounded in reality. But once you go beyond that, ask a 3-year-old, ask a 5-year-old, ask a 10-year-old, even ask us. That's why I made you uncomfortable at the beginning. You missed this, but I said Hashem is no more spiritual than he is physical. It's equally wrong to think of him as spiritual either, also. Which means why I wanted to make you uncomfortable, because then it means I have no metric, I have no method, I have no medium, I have no structure, no scheme, nothing that I can use. I just have to just be quiet. Hence the Rambam's via negativa, his all of the negative attributes, because there's nothing else. I'm not left with anything. Yeah. Now this is a very challenging concept. And the Torah speaks in those terms. So, I mean, I've even seen some people write and ask that it therefore follows that the Torah is misleading us. Because you then need to turn it round with Torah Sheba'al Peh and say that even though there are numerous anthropomorphic references to Hashem, Yad Hashem, Einei Hashem, Oznei Hashem, he's sitting on his kisei, and I saw him, and he's all this, many, and it's Dibra Torah Koloshen B'nei Adam. That's the reason it's put there, so that I should be able to relate to it, but really you can't relate to it. Because it belongs to a whole class and a category of, I was going to say category of things. It's not things, it's only one thing. There is Hashem who is unknowable. So I'm really, it's very challenging. And I have to go against that. And at the same time, the Rambam says, but you have an absolute chiyuv to teach this to kids who are incapable of understanding it, which is what we're about to learn. This is very challenging. That's all I'm saying at this stage.
It's certain, even though this is true that the Torah is given in man's language, that it still pertains more, let's say, or in a different way to a different time. And now that we have the obligation to keep up as much as our understanding, ways of speaking, and ways of comprehending the world through language changed. So we have to needs more updates or remind us more about what the language of the Torah was meant or how it was meant. Whereas maybe, let's say, the first generations, Har Sinai and then off, everything was more clear because that, let's assume when it says Yad Hashem, everybody knew it wasn't the real hand. They had more of a concept, even though it's impossible to have the real concept, but they knew, so to say, more what it is.
You're making a very okay. Let me expand. I think you're making a very, very good point, and if I'm honest, I hadn't thought of it properly. Let me permit me to try and tell me if this is what you meant, because if this is what you meant, I think it's a very good point. Remember, the authenticity and the veracity of the Torah is on the basis of it being handed down. Midor l'dor. Right. So you have the first generation of an entire nation who, quote unquote, experienced Hashem. Vayiru es Elokim. They experienced whatever they experienced. Yeah. It was enough. And by the way, when we get to the eighth Yisoid, we will discuss the Machlokas Rambam, Ramban, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, exactly what the level, the Ran, exactly what level of Nevuah Klal Yisrael achieved at Matan Torah, whether it was exactly the same as Moshe's. It wasn't, but it was a very, very, very high level Madrega, and possibly very close, or at least temporarily the same as Moshe Rabbeinu's. They had as much as a human being can possibly see and experience Hashem whilst being alive. Well, they died, and that incredible experience, which, as you point out quite rightly, was clearly enough. And Fakert, Hashem builds on this in Parshas Voschanan, and he says, remember, Remember, ki lo re'isam kol tamuna. This was part of this was part of our national, shared, lived experience, which was then handed down midor ledor. And father would tell son, I experienced Hashem. I know he exists. And therefore we are told, Hisham Elecha, don't forget what happened on Har Sinai on that day. That you saw Hashem, don't forget. Rak Hisham Elecha, pentishkach es advarim et sharo enecha. Ufen yosurim elvavcha, veidatum levanecha, velivnei vanecha, yoim asher amadas lefnei Hashem elekecha b'chayrev. You heard it, you saw it, you experienced it. In the words of the Rambam, you personally validated the level of Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. All of us. We were the Eidim. And that got handed down and handed down and handed down. Which it definitely did. At some point in time, it becomes, with the best will in the world, as we say, it becomes still challenging to look at the Torah which says, Yad Hashem, Einei Hashem, Oznei Hashem, and yet we know, because we have this tradition, it has been handed down to us, that Hashem doesn't have a hand, he doesn't have, so then why? So what you're saying is, it doesn't mean that that there would be a challenge to the concept, it would just become complicated, it would become, at some point it would become difficult to, on the one hand, read a Torah with Yad Hashem, Einei Hashem, and at the same time I know, because my father told me, and his father told him, and his father told him, that Hashem is not physical at all. And that the Rambam explains, so Dibra Torah Koloshen B'nei Adam. That's why it's put in those terms. So I think what you've done is that what you were saying?
Yes, and basically you answered this point of it not being misleading, obviously, since the beginning, because initially it wasn't, and then it becomes an intergenerational responsibility to be handed down with Torah Sheba'al Peh, and it might be even a mechanism that ensures that something so fundamental and so simple yet complicated at the same time has to be addressed, and it's something that very much sets us apart to avoid the Zohar in this very fundamental way. So I would, now thinking further, say that it might be even a mechanism to make sure that this is a central part of Torah Sheba'al Peh.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're right. I like it a lot. Here's the problem that we have with this. The problem that we have with this is that somewhere along the line, and I don't want to say too much at this stage, but somewhere along the line, clearly, some of this message did not get through successfully. So that when the Rambam writes this in the form that he does in Moreh Nevuchim and in Mada, in Sefer, in Yad, with what we learned, there was a backlash. There definitely was a backlash, as we're going to see historically.
Maybe that's part of the film.
How do we know what to choose?
But that was
whoa, slow down. Whoa, guys, slow down. One thing at a time. The point is, I'm still with him. That the Ibn Ezra. Let's go back to the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra told us yesterday that Chachmei Doireinu, he writes without comment, explain the tefillin of Hashem as being literally physical tefillin of Hashem. And he calls them Chachmei Doireinu. So we have the Ravad telling us, Rabim Gedolim Mimenu. Whether it's Mimenu is the Chazon Ish Mimenu or the other Mimenu, doesn't matter. But there's Rabim and Gedolim. And as we're going to see, as we're going to get to, maybe still today, there was a big backlash. There was a ban. There was a cherem on the Rambam, partly at least because of this. So it's not so poshut to say...
But partly, but not primarily, no?
Sorry?
Partly, but not primarily. Is that?
It's debatable.
Was everyone thinking that it was literal?
I don't know.
Sorry?
He was the first one to say that the tefillin of Hashem isn't literally?
No, I don't think he was the first one. But... We'll put it into some historical context a bit later.
He might be the first one who says, read my book and you don't have to study the Talmud.
You don't have to what?
And you don't have to study anything else anymore.
That's a sideshow. That's not what...
But I thought that was like the main...
That's not... No, that's... Let's keep... there's so much to say, but we need to keep focused on the Hagshama. So back to the Rambam. We have... the Rambam writing here. Let's go through this. Moreh Nevuchim Chelik Aleph Perek Lamed Hey. Omno Harchokas hagshoma v'hasoras hadimui v'hahifoaloyus me Hashem. This idea, rejecting and negating corporeality, any idea of being able to compare him to something, or actions or activity or change or movement, rejection, all of that. Hu inyan sheroi levaroi lechol adam kafi mashehu. This is something that needs to be explained to everybody. Lemosrei bekabbalah lektanim ulenoshim ulesecholim ulechasrei haseichel. Those who are incapable intellectually of understanding it and working it out, how do you hand it down to them? Bekabbalah. You say to them, this is our tradition. This is what we have been makabel. You can't. They don't have the intellectual capacity to work it out, but we hand it down to them. But you need to hand it down to them. In other words, he's suggesting, don't. No, but that should resist. Even right down to the Piaseczner Rebbe in the Warsaw Ghetto, writes in one of his Sfarim, and the Bnei Soscha and others talk much more softly. I'll give you the Makoros about allowing a child to think, when he's a little child, to think of Hashem as a grandfatherly figure with a big smile, and I know we just moved. I know, but maybe not a red and white coat, but that concept when they are young and then they graduate from it. And the Rambam here is seemingly saying no. Not everybody would necessarily agree with that. You know, the story with the Arizal, which the Chidah brings. There was a simple man in Tzfas who would go and give a loaf of bread, put it in the Aron HaKodesh every day to feed Hashem. The Gabba found out. Every day the Gabba would go see the bread and take it away. And this fellow was convinced the Rebbein Shai was eating his bread. So the Rav, whoever it was, told the fellow not to be such an idiot. And the Ari HaKodesh says it was very merutza to HaKodesh Baruch Hu.
Okay.
And there are other. In other words, the response, rather than being, you have an obligation and a duty to teach this fellow that this is rubbish, this is apikoros, it seems to be a little bit softer. Interesting. There are other sources, Koshnitzer Magid, and correct. And we're only talking about the. You're right, absolutely. We're only talking about it vis-a-vis how strict and literal and unyielding you are in terms of the chinuch, if you like. So here's the Rambam says the Rambam lemosrei bekabbalah lektanim l'scholim l'chasrei haseichel k'moishi yimosar lahem shehu echad v'shehu kadmon v'shelo yavod zulosoi ki ein yichud kiyim b'hasaras hagashmus ki hageshem eino echad avol mukim michayim v'tzura. And then he goes on. I should have really emboldened it in the next line in the middle. When they accept it, bitmimus, as a young child, and then v'yizbalbelu b'kisvei sifrei hanavim, yavu lahem inyonim v'yafusha lahem rishon. And then as they learn, and they get confused, because they will, they'll open a chumash, and then they see, what do you mean? Daddy, you told me Hashem is one, he's here, he's there, he's everywhere, but you can't see him, but he doesn't have a hand. And they go to Chumash, and then they start learning about the hand of Hashem, and the ears of Hashem, and the eyes of Hashem, and the throne of Hashem, and they get Yizbalbelu. They become confused, so then you need to start explaining to them more. What would be if somebody's incapable? You say to him, look, okay, you may not understand it, but the Chachamim do. But you should know Hashem is Barach Einoi Guf. You need to know Hashem is incorporeal. That's what you should say. And the Divrei Nevi'im is MS. The Ein Tzarich, the end of the quote. The Ein Tzarich shetis yashiv das Adam על אמונס הגשומה, או על אמונס מסיג ממסיגי הגשומim, כמו שאין צורך שישב על אמונס הדר אלא כאלה שיתופי דוב. You don't need to be able to understand it. Probably because you can't. A lot of people can't. You need to teach it to them. First you teach them by Kabbalah. As they become a bit older, you teach them to understand it a little bit more. And when you hit the brick wall, then you go back to Kabbalah, and that's that. But because, of course, in the Rambam's scheme of things, this is so important, you can't just leave it out. And you can't just, you don't have the luxury of leaving it out because you're a min if you got it wrong. And it's complicated, but you just have to do it. This is the Rambam, fascinating. On the side of the Rambam, here in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, there is a Perush. It's called the Perush. And here, on this halacha, he says as follows. HaTorah, source 8. HaTorah nitna l'chol hamoin Yisrael anoshim v'noshim v'taf. The Torah was given to everybody. V'Hashem yodea hamachshavos, sheyoda, sheme'achar shehem gufim mechubarim me'arba yisodos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew that man is made up of elements, made up of the four Eish, Mayim, Ruach, Afa. Therefore, it's impossible for a human being to fully appreciate and understand that which does not contain any of these elements. He therefore spoke to them in anthropomorphic terms, which they can understand. Then, as they get older and become more intellectually competent, then they'll realize that it was only a figurative. It's in our language so that we should understand it. Also, I think this Perush is going even further than the Rambam, but he's saying that it was all deliberately written in I struggle here with the word. It's misleading is the wrong word. At the same time, it's challenging. Yeah, it's challenging. Mm-hmm. But he's saying that it's functional. That for the same reason that many of the Mefarshim say that the Torah never speaks about things. It doesn't. That's one of the answers why the Torah doesn't speak about Olam Haba, because it only talks about things which are within our experience. And then, but then we have Hashem, so we're a bit stuck. Okay, let's move on. Two more sources before we get stuck into the history. Let's see if we'll even get started it today. The first thing is, and this is really, really interesting. I only came across this Maramokim a little bit later, which is why I would have probably put it in earlier. And this is basically a short piece from the Rambam in Moira, where he basically says, no Chacham ever worth his salt, ever seriously contemplating Hashem being corporeal. Now this is clearly in contrast to the Ravad and to the Ibn Ezra and others, by the way. There's others that Reb Sadia Gaon, and there's others. Look what he says. Kva omru zal mama koilel doichel chol ma shemarin oisen atorim hagashom v'hu mama yerlecha sha'achachamim zal loy ola b'datam ha'hagashom klal v'loy hoya etzlam inyan yishabesh o yisafek shum odom. Nobody ever had a doubt about whether Hashem was in any way corporeal or not. And clearly, like I said, Ibn Ezra, Reb Sadia Gaon, and others clearly would not agree with that. Says the Chovos Halvavos. Remember that again, this was written in Arabic, but it's the best that we can do. It's in Shara Yichud Perek Yud. Va'asher naskim alav kulanu, ki hadchak hevienu lahagshim aboyre yizbarach. Dchak is the an extreme situation. We didn't have a choice. We were forced to be magshim habayre yizbarach, to talk about him in physical terms. Ulesaper oise b'midas habruim. Kedei l'sha'er inyan so that we could
Conserve.
express or approximate or estimate an idea, so that the existence of Hashem should remain as a concept. We were therefore there was something that compelled us to talk about it in anthropomorphic terms. They used language that was close to, this is exactly like the Perush that we just saw, right? If the Torah, the Nevi'im, would have used terminology, the right sort of terminology to negate physicality or indeed even spirituality, we would not have understood neither the words nor their meaning. It would have become an impossibility to serve that which I cannot know. It's impossible to serve something that you don't know anything about. Therefore, the words and the context had to be in terms that the listener could understand. And then as you become more you wiser, then we'll teach you that was really only a moshel. And the real meaning is the maskil, the passionate intellectual will try hard to get rid of the husks, the shells of the externals, the levush of the words that are used and their physicality, and instead but the ksil, the fool, hapesi. So let's just stop here for a second. The first point I'd like to make here, you know what, should I ask you? Should we ask you? I think we might have an argument then, but I'm okay with that. Do you see this as being the same as source 7?
No.
Correct. I agree with you. Very good, Gabby. Explain.
No, here it's the notion in I think in source 7.
Yeah.
It's more that we say people get mibalbel, and one does not really need to understand.
So, very good. The Rambam writes very clearly, we need to tell youngsters, those that are incapable of having an understanding, we need to tell them.
But that's just for them. We don't have to.
We need to tell them that what? We need to tell them Hashem does not have a body.
But that's just because of their lack of seichel.
Of course. But the key point here is the Chovos Halvavos seems to be legitimating. He seems to be happy. In fact, in other words, if you were to sit at a chinuch shir by the Chovos Halvavos, and the discussion, the Q&A would be about how do I tell my 2-year-old about Hashem, who doesn't have a body? The Chovos Halvavos would say to you, don't tell them that.
Yeah, they will.
Don't, because they can't. So don't tell them. Don't even tell them that. Let them think that Hashem has a body.
He doesn't have like a notion of prevention.
Correct.
Of like,
whereas the Rambam, if he was sitting at the table, if he was on the chinuch panel, he would say, no, chas v'sholem, you have to save them from hell.
Right. So
I'm pointing out we have here a fascinating machlokes rishonim, which is really a chinuch thing as well.
Chovos Halvavos is way more enthusiastic about the.
Yeah, he's okay with it.
Yeah.
And wait, we're not even finished.
But
so that's a machlokes, Chovos Halvavos and the Rambam on this. Okay, I only became aware of this quite recently from a footnote in a sefer I saw. But we're not even done.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. Okay, thank you, Gabby. Absolutely spot on. Let's go on here. We are up to V'haksil. It's about 2/3 of the way down. The line begins with the word yicholtoi.
Yeah.
3 words in. V'haksil hapesi. The fool. The simpleton. Yachshev habayra yizbarach al derech hanira mimlitzas hasefer. He will appreciate Hashem. He'll think of him as indeed the Torah speaks. Anthropomorphism. Ukshu mekabel al atzmei avodas elokav v'hu mishtadel la'asos lichvoidai. And when he accepts upon himself to serve Hashem, this pesi, this ksil, and he tries to do things right, then he has a problem because of his lack of intelligence. But here he says, and this fellow is going to struggle. He's going to struggle. He wants to try and serve Hashem, but he's not capable of appreciating. I mean, neither are we, but he's not even capable of appreciating that Hashem doesn't have a body. And here says that Chavis Halvav is something astounding. Yeshloi ta'ano gedola. He has a good excuse because of his lack of intelligence. Mipnei she'ein ha'odam nitba elo kvi yecholtoi v'hasagosoi b'sichloi v'havonosoi v'koichoi u'mamoinoi. A person can only be held liable, accountable, according to his capacities. What circumstance? Capacities.
Yeah.
And this is in direct contradiction to the Rambam we learnt the other day in the Makor was, where the Rambam says you have no excuse. The Rambam used those words, remember? You have no excuse. Those were the words of the Rambam. Rega. Yeah, that was in source 5. That's the Rambam in Chelik Aleph Perek Moira Chelik Aleph Perek Lamed Vav. He says if you're going to start excusing them, then we have to start excusing the Oved Avodah Zarah as well. He also gets it wrong. Says the Chavis Halvavos, he's with the Raavad. Chavis Halvavos is with the Raavad very clearly. Yesh li Tana Gedola.
Probably the Chavazolo is with the Raavad to this extent, but wouldn't go as far as says that there are a lot of Gedolim that hold like this, maybe.
That could be. Sorry, he goes. He's with the Raavad as saying that he's not. To argue with the Rambam that this person would not be called a min, he wouldn't lose his chelik and olam haba. That's what I meant. You're quite right. I should clarify. In that nakuda only, correct. But he goes on to say, and it could be, we could argue. It could be now we have to do a 180 degrees. Look at the next phrase. But if the foolish person had opportunity to learn from a Rebbe, from a book, from a Shir or something, and he was theoretically capable of advancing and developing his knowledge, and he didn't, then he will be held accountable if he was able to learn. Now, maybe he wouldn't have been able, and here I think he's rowing back just a little bit. And it could be, therefore, it's not necessarily, there's a total machlokas. Could be the Raavad is now more extreme than the Chavis Halvavos. Chavis Halvavos might, because the Rambam actually said, if you remember, he actually did say that people do have, one of the reasons, he says, because you have opportunities to learn. And there's arrogance if you don't accept from the Chachamim, and the fact that you're not able to understand it, and it gets more dacastic, and I don't want to get into it more, but he is rowing back a little bit. You can't just have limited intelligence, at the same time have opportunities to learn, and don't learn. No. If you have an opportunity you are exposed to a Rebbe, a book, whatever it is, you could and should have, and you didn't, that's different. Yeah? Ve'ilu haya noheg ha-sefer, כשמתרגם העניין הזה, המנהג הרוי באמיתו של יוכל להבין קידם המשכיל בלבד, היו נשארים רוב המדברים בלי דס ובלי תורה. He's talking about Targum. If Targum would be translated as it is, in ways that we couldn't appreciate, only the maskil, then hayu nisharim roiv hamadabrim beli das ubeli Torah mipnei kitza sichlom v'chalishus hakaras minyanam aruchniim ki hadova sheyuvan mimenu inyan gashmi lo yazik hamaskil. Risk reward.
Oh.
If you put something in a physical terms, the masker won't lose out because
Right.
he's got chazal, he knows how to interpret it.
The majority
Neshu
are not-
makiboy. But umoy laksil, but it helps the foolish. Kedei lahasyashe beliboy b'daitoi ki yesh loy boyrei shehu chayav b'avoidosoi. I have a God. I have to serve him. He seems to be physical. Whatever. Okay. Mistake. But at least if we would have gone straight from 0 to 100 and only ever had ideas of Hashem being, can't even say spiritual anymore, not being physical, not being anything that we can possibly understand or relate to, we would have lost. My only problem with this, which I do struggle with a little bit, is if we had, which we do have, an unbroken chain of tradition, then how did we arrive? What was the problem? What was the concern of the Chovos HaLevavos? He was worried we'd get to a point where we'd have, quote, Roiv Hamadabrim B'li Dasu B'li Torah. How would we have Roiv Hamadabrim? Sorry?
Sometimes in history, a lot of people didn't have access.
What, to parents?
Maybe not the parents, but
Your grandmother, my great-grandmother, they were not probably couldn't read. Sorry.
yes.
Great-great-grandparents. But they had emunah, call it emunah pshuta, whatever. They had, because they were told, and they were okay with that. Until Haskalah came along. Until we needed Sarah Shnira, because we had no choice anymore. But therefore I'm actually struggling to understand the concern of the Chovos HaLevavos. So in other words, kind of make up your mind. Let's look at the facts that we have. Let's try and understand the facts. The facts are, it would appear to be that there, on the basis of the Eidos of the Ibn Ezra and other Rishonim, there were significant numbers of Chachomim who believed in corporeality. So something went wrong somewhere from the Rambam's perspective, right?
Yeah.
Something went wrong somewhere. There's Gedolim v'Tovim Mimenu. It did happen. How did that happen? The only lichura, one would have to say it happened because the psukim and the targumim and everything pushed people in the wrong direction, despite the Messiah. The alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is that the Rambam came up with it, and that one we're certainly not going to countenance. Okay, so you should be. I'm struggling. There's a circle here that I don't know how to square. On the one hand, just purely in terms of the. Oh, no, it's not stopped. Yeah, no, please. I'm enough. I can't deal with what I believe. Yeah, they reject Torah Shabbat Peh B'chlal.
No, okay, but that means there are corporalities. Do they?
I don't know, or particularly care at the moment. But the yes, Gabi.
What does he mean with the medabrim?
Roiv HaMedabrim. Most people that
Medabrim.
speak.
That speak. A medaber is any person because the man is the one who the medaber is.
Yeah, but
I'm saying.
Therefore, so what's your point?
So my point is that if he says it's lahavdil, the mashal is maybe a little bit like lahavdil. It functions like pop music, right? You have awesome music which is really complex and beautiful, but the majority of people will not understand it. So you have first they have to get the one that reaches everyone and is easily understandable, but is flawed. It is flawed in the sense that it is not qualitative, high in quality.
So you haven't answered my. I understand what you're saying.
I'm getting to the.
Go. Yeah.
So, and therefore, it is necessary that the majority of people get it as like a corridor, the low quality things, to work on it and understand it, and then get out of the flaws by getting involved in it.
I get your metaphor.
If you see the medabrin as stam people, just very.
But
how can it be that there are chachamim that are in the Messiah?
First of all, chachamim, and more than that,
where are the chachamim here?
No, not here. But we saw the Ravad, the Ibn Ezra, and others. I'm struggling just with the almost the historical fact. How did it happen?
Yeah.
that
We
we...
have to say that Torah is taking risk, so to say. There is an element of risk.
So, in
always.
other words, he's saying,
So
and this is what he's
It can be
saying.
potentially misleading, but it can not.
So you're saying,
It
so
has to be
the
somewhat misleading.
Chavis is saying, actually, this was a safeguard mechanism to
Yeah.
protect the integrity of the Torah, even though it was using a very quote-unquote risky method,
Yeah.
because in the words of many Rishonim, Yizbalbalu from the Targumim, from the Nevi'im, they would become...
It can happen. Yeah.
And
But
that's what happens
the
when
risk
you have to
reward,
do the seichel.
Yeah.
he makes a cheshbon, the risk
Right.
reward for the ksilim versus
Yeah.
the risk reward for the maskilim, and it taka happened. And it happened even to the point where many chachamim and gedolim were wrong, so to speak, despite the Masorah. This is a fascinating sugya. Next time in Mitzvah Hashem, Monday, we will start talking about, we'll get into the history of the what happened to the Chachmei Provence and the ban, Rabbeinu Yonah, the letter of the Ramban. It gets really, really fascinating. But I think we're done at least on, I mean, there's probably much more to say, but there's, I just wanted to open it up a little bit. It's I find it absolutely, I hope you think so as well, fascinating.